All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about the general structure and function of muscle tissue. So before we break down and kind of talk about the kind of differences between the types of muscle, let's kind of review big picture. What are the key characteristics of a muscle? So one of the biggest characteristics of a muscle is to move stuff throughout the body, right? So if you think about your digestive tract, right? If you think about the veins in your body and how blood gets pumped throughout your entire body, that is controlled in part through muscle tissue, right? And that's specifically your smooth muscle, right? Which you don't have much control over. You can influence, but it's largely out of your control. So moving substances throughout the body. Another key characteristic of muscle is to produce movement between bones, right? So you think the classic example of the curl, right? I'm using my biceps brachii to move my radius and ulna up towards my humerus. So a key characteristic of muscle is the production of movement as well. And then a third key characteristic of our muscle is to generate heat for our body, right? You think about in the wintertime, you're really cold, you wake up and you're chattering, your jaw's like, or you just feel really cold, the hair on your skin is standing up, right? That heat production is due through muscle contraction. So now that we have kind of a general distinction of the key characteristics of what a muscle is, let's go into the three types of muscle because there are different types of muscle as well. So one of the primary groups of muscle that everyone knows, everyone has, is cardiac muscle located in the heart. One really unique property about these cardiac cells or these cardiac muscle cells is that they have spontaneous contractility, right? So if you were to have grown or like taken a sample of these cells and developed them in a petri dish away from our nervous system and away from kind of hormones to act on the heart, these muscle cells would still contract on their own. So they have this property of spontaneous contractility where they just, they all synchronously contract at the same time. And they'll just do this. It's just their properties. It's unique. It's very unique to them. It's what they do. The second group of muscle cells that we have are smooth muscle cells. So if you think going back to the alimentary canal, the digestive tract, we have smooth muscle cells that produce the movement to get our food, from our mouth to our stomach, all the way out of our body. And so these have cool kind of properties as well, where there's actually two layers of muscle cells. If you think in the digestive tract, right? You have a longitudinal layer, right? So running long, right? And then you have a circular layer that just kind of circles around like the lumen of the space. And so through this kind of double layered muscle cell structure, you can have both constricting types of contractions to where you can segment off parts of the digestive tract. And then you also have long kind of compressive contractions. So if you needed to segment food up and if your body needed to break food down more, right, it can use its circular layer of muscle to constrict certain parts of the digestive tract and break up that food to make it easier for your body to uptake those nutrients and to digest. Another cool part, the longitudinal layer, right? So that can constrict and flatten the lumen. And so that, could say you could allow for an extra kind of absorption time, right? So instead of just having the lumen nice, open, and very wide, you constrict it. So then the nutrients are closer to the epithelial layer So there could be a higher percentage of absorption. The third type of muscle, and where we're going to spend most of our time today, is talking about the skeletal muscle. And so skeletal muscle, right, is the only muscle that is voluntarily controlled. So, you know, it's the muscle that almost everyone thinks about too. So getting into that and breaking down the skeletal muscle now, we're going to have to do kind of a deep dive, right? So if you look at the structure on the left, we have a very light bone. And then in red, we would have our muscle. At the green, kind of like most prominent color up top here. So that's our tendon, right? So tendon connects muscles to bones. Almost every muscle will have at least one tendon. And so the tendon, right, if you remember, it's dense, regular connective tissue. So it's really, really good at resisting movements in one plane of direction. And so now, if we were to take a cross section of our muscle cell and kind of expand it up and blow it up, going back to what I said earlier, skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, right? So if you can think it, you can do it, right? And there's also really kind of cool reflex responses that happen in the muscle that are not under control, but there's still this really cool, really awesome things that happen with muscle, really cool properties of skeletal muscle. So a muscle is innervated by a nerve, right? And so that's kind of in depth. You can break that down, and there's a whole kind of lot of information that you can find. But real basically, a nerve will come and will sit on the muscle belly, right? So this area right here, this first layer of like the top layer of muscle tissue is called the Epimysium or the Epimysium. And so the Epimysium is a dense, irregular connective tissue that sits on the outermost part of the muscle belly. And so the Epimysium is dense, irregular, right? So that means it can withstand forces from multi-planes, or has multiplanar force resistance. And so a function of the Epimysium is to, one, create that envelope for all of the other smaller structures within the muscle to be held into place and, you know, not be moving all over the place, right? So it creates that nice kind of clear envelope for those distinct muscle groups to function. And then a second property of the Epimysium, right, is it helps reduce the amount of friction between the muscles. And so you have a lot of muscles everywhere, and some of them are overlapping, some of them are crisscrossing, you know, some of them are running over, sometimes you have tendons running over muscles. And so the Epimysium is just a nice, dense, irregular connective tissue that will help reduce that friction of, you know, the contractility of muscles. And so a nerve will come down. And so a nerve that innervates a muscle is called a motor neuron. And so this motor neuron will come down and will sit on a specific part of the epimysium, and it's called the neuromuscular junction. And so with the neuromuscular junction, right, depolarization of the nerves runs down the nerve, sending an action potential to the muscle. The action potential reaches the neuromuscular junction, and at that neuromuscular junction, from the neuron, there is a release of acetylcholine, which will cause, right? So I'm getting ahead of myself here. And this is also more physiology. You won't really have to know this for basic anatomy of the muscle, but for me, it's really helpful to understand the how and the why. Instead of just knowing the how and not really understanding the why, it's great to kind of have exposure to both of them. And so at the epimysium, there is a release of acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine, right? So we're going to drop down a layer here. And so inside of all the muscle bellies, there's muscle fascicle, right? So we have one fascicle pulled out and drawn out that we are going to look at specifically here, right? So this is one muscle fascicle. And then, so inside this one, there's a total of 8 fascicles that make up the muscle belly. So the muscle fascicles are a subunit of the muscle, the whole muscle, but it's still a very macro, big picture, right? So the muscle fascicle, there is an outer layer called the perimysium. And the perimysium, the same thing as the epimysium, is dense, irregular connective tissue that helps reduce the friction among the contractility of the different fascicles. And so inside of the fascicle, right, you have hundreds, or it depends on the size of the muscle, right? So obviously, if we were looking at one of the muscles, say the orbicularis oris, right, like the circular muscle around the mouth that controls the movement of the lips, there would not be as many fascicles as there would be, say, in your rectus femoris, right, one of the main muscles of the anterior thigh. So the muscle fascicle and the amount of fascicles is dependent on the size of the muscle, and as goes for most things, right? You're going to have fewer neurons innervating a muscle, the smaller it is. So there's going to be fewer motor neurons going to a muscle and fewer neuromuscular junctions to control the contractility of a muscle. And so inside the muscle fascicles is the real baseline unit of a muscle called the muscle cell, right? So muscle cells and or muscle fibers, right, are the base component. They're synonymous. So you hear it most times referred to as a muscle fiber instead of a muscle cell, but they are synonymous. So a muscle fiber is the baseline, kind of the base unit. And so you have a multiple, you could have 20, you could have 200, depends on the muscle, and it depends on kind of where that muscle is located and the function of that muscle. Like, is it a primary mover, right? You'd expect to find more fascicles in the legs than you would in some of the facial muscles, just because the demand of those muscles is greater than of the muscles of the face. So muscle fibers are the base unit, and they control the contraction of the muscle. And so a muscle fiber is made up of this structure right here, which I've drawn out, which is called a sarcomere. So the sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscle fiber. And the sarcomeres, right, are composed, so the contractile right, fibers and the contractile components of the actual sarcomere are called the myofibrils. And so we have the 2 myofibrils that are most noted and most talked about, very light at the bottom here. We have actin, all right, and this very thick one, this red one, is myosin. So myosin and actin are the rod-like bundles that actually contract within the muscle. And so you'll have repeating units of sarcomeres all throughout this muscle fiber. And so that it's those repeated subunits of sarcomeres that all contract. And that is what causes the whole, roll up the sleeve here, that is what causes the contraction of the whole muscle, right? So within that actual contraction of the bicep, we have hundreds and hundreds, thousands of these sarcomere base units. The actin is moving, right? So the actin pulls in on the myosin. Causing a contraction. And so you can't see it that well, but these, right, as I was doing with my hands, right? So if you envision my phalanges as the actin units, right? And then the space in between is the myosin. The actin grabs onto the myosin and moves in and actually contracts, and that shortens the actual length of the sarcomere. So every sarcomere inside this one muscle fiber is being shortened, and then every muscle fiber inside the fascicle is being shortened. Every fascicle is being shortened. So that creates the noticeable contraction. Really cool, fascinating stuff. And so if we go back to what I was saying way earlier at the neuromuscular junction with the motor neuron, right? The motor neuron is responsible for sending the action potential, right? The message, right? From the neuron to the neuromuscular junction. And so now that we have this base unit of a sarcomere, I'm going to take some time. So I kind of talked about it beforehand, right? So we have our thick banded myofibril, our myosin. And so this part of the sarcomere is noted as the A band, right? And so our actin, right, our very, very thin, almost non-visible marker right there, that's our I band. Okay, now you see these kind of tornado looking things off the side, they're more visible over here. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what are these? So the myosin, right, it's not just kind of off in no man's land, but it has to be anchored, right? So this right here, these very kind of light, thick brown markings, that's what's called titin. And so titin is a spring-like protein that binds the myosin to this structure right here. So this structure on the side, right, this green, that's what's called your Z disc. And so off of the Z disc, you will have titin, a protein which holds myosin into place. And then you will also have your actin units coming off of another part of the Z disc, right? So the Z disc is what holds the myofibrils into place. And so not drawn on the Z disc, but to kind of give a little physiology explanation. So like superficial to the Z disc, you have what's called your T tubule or the transverse tubule. And off of the T tubule, right? So if you think also superficial to this, so think if I was to have drawn, I would be drawing on top of this. So you have your T tubule, which runs down on top of the Z disc. And then running off either side to the other Z disc, right? So in between the sarcomere and like the myosin and the actin subunits, you have your sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so the transverse tube, the T tubule, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum are both responsible for taking the message that was sent from the neuromuscular junction. And so let's take a step back here. right? So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is what holds calcium. And we know that calcium has just a very high driving force, right? Calcium has one of the lowest intracellular proportions out of all the ions. So calcium is a huge second messenger and is responsible for kind of starting the intracellular message of a lot of depolarization of nerves, the contraction of muscles. Calcium is a huge kind of second messenger in the ability of our body to do that. And so calcium is stored within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so a message is sent from the neuromuscular junction into the fascicle. And that message, right, causes the release of calcium through the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the T-tubule and then onto so there are other subunits of actin and myosin that actually compose the contraction of a muscle. So there's roughly 4-5 stages of contraction. And so that's kind of another unit, and I'll definitely make a more detailed video kind of talking about the actual contraction of a muscle and more like the physiologic side of it. But the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the T-tubule are responsible for sending calcium throughout the entire sarcomere so that proper contraction of every actin and muscle within the motor unit can be made. So now that we have a real basic understanding of how a muscle works, what a muscle does, and then the different properties of a muscle, let's talk about the different types of muscle, because there are actual different types of skeletal muscle. So one of the first and basic types of muscle is the parallel muscle. And so a good example of the parallel muscle is one that I've drawn right here. So a parallel muscle is that there's a tendon on either side of the muscle, right? So if you think of your biceps, right, and roll up the sleeve again, but there's a tendon that pops up into the kind of the shoulder region, and then there's another tendon that pulls down into the elbow region, right? And so if you look at the bicep, right, these are long muscle fascicles running in parallel to one another, right? So what they provide one of the greatest lengths of contraction. And so that is the example of parallel muscle. Going on, we have pennate muscle. And so pennate muscle can be further divided into two subtypes, right? You have bipennate and multipennate. And so let's take a step back here. So what defines a pennate muscle, right? So a pennate muscle is defined as a muscle whose tendon runs the whole length of the muscle. So if you hear pennate, I always think of feather, right? So if there was to be a quick depiction of what a pennate muscle would look like, you could draw the feather and then boom, you have the kind of the feathers running off. So these would be the muscle fascicles. And right, a bipennate muscle, there would be muscle fascicles on both sides of the tendon, really giving that feather-like example. So if you think of a bipennate muscle, you can think of the rectus femoris or the vastus intermedius, right? So the muscle is going to have that feather-like, distinct two different fascicles running in two different directions. So a multipennate, on the other hand, right? Multi meaning many. There's many fascicles running many directions, and they all insert to one common tendon. So we're going to roll up the sleeve one final time here. If you think of the muscles of the deltoid, right? There are many different fibers running in very many different directions, but they all insert into one area. So multipennate, right? I always think about one of those kind of big plants that just has like, I don't know, an explosion of like leaves or something, like a bush or something, right? There's just a lot of points that all come down to one stem. So a perfect example would be your deltoid muscle. Moving on to our third type, we have convergent muscles. And so convergent muscles, they have a very broad and lengthened origin point, and then they fan down and they shape into one common insertion point. And so a perfect example of this would be your pectoralis major. So if you think convergent, fan shaped. So if you were to look at your chest, right? So your chest originates on the sternum, your clavicle, and then I believe it's ribs 1 through 6. But then it inserts into, don't quote me on this, your greater tubercle. And so if you think about that, this area, this whole area of the chest would allow for this massive fanning into one common point. So if you hear convergent, think fan shaped, and a perfect example of that would be the pectoralis major. Oh my goodness. Or the big chest muscle, right? So starts very wide, very broad origin, and then very, finds its way into one common insertion point. So our final type of muscle is our circular muscle. And circular, just like the name implies, it's circular. So if you think of the muscles of the eye and the mouth, I believe the orbicularis oris and the orbicularis oculus, could be wrong, but these are circular shaped muscles. Another great example of circular shaped muscles is through smooth muscles. And if you think of the sphincter muscles, right, that section off the stomach to make sure that, right, no chemicals, like the digestive enzymes of the stomach get sent back up into the esophagus, right? There's a sphincter there. Sometimes just doesn't function that well, or sometimes you eat stuff that's not that good, and then too much acid comes back up into the esophagus and you get heartburn, right? So there is a circular muscle that sits at the top of the stomach that sections off the stomach from the esophagus. And then there's another one right at the edge of the stomach that separates the stomach off from the small intestine. And of course, I can keep going. You have a bunch of other sphincters located in different areas that have control, right? Like they're like a valve. They turn on and they shut things off. And so to review, just a quick, out of all of these four, if you were to look at the strength of a muscle, pennate muscle allows for the strongest type of contraction, followed by convergent muscle, followed by parallel muscle. So parallel muscle is the weakest type of contraction possible. Pennate muscle would be one of the strongest types of contraction. Now, if you were to do the inverse, if you were looking at the contractibility and that specific quality of a muscle, parallel muscle offers the biggest contractile percentage, right? Like the greatest percent of this muscle is contracted, right? So you look at the biceps, a lot of, like almost 1/3 of that muscle just got contracted. But you can't really do that with the deltoid, right? And think about the pec. A fair bit of the pec gets contracted, but when you're doing that bench press, it's always hard to contract the full chest, right? So parallel muscle offers your greatest contractible property out of the muscles, followed by convergent muscles, and then pennate muscles offer the weakest type of extensible contraction, right? So it's the least extensible, but it's the strongest to contract. So guys, that was a real big, broad overview of the general structure, function, and some facts about muscles. I hope you enjoyed this quick little review, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. Have a great one.